I turned 82 the same way I turned 81, quietly, invisibly, and without any celebration to mark the passing of another year. The morning began with a knock on the door of my room at Juniper Pines, the assisted living facility that has been my so-called home for the past 3 years. A young staff member named Kelsey came in with a small tray, a lukewarm muffin with a flickering candle stuck into its crust, and a card signed in thick marker, "From all of us." I smiled and thanked her, and she smiled back in that polite way. People smile at the elderly when they're doing something nice they've already forgotten halfway through. I waited until she left the room to let the candle burn itself out, flickering against the beige walls before folding over and dying in a soft curl of smoke. I didn't touch the muffin. The room was clean, impersonal. Beige curtains, beige walls, a standard hospital-style bed with a plastic wood frame, and a narrow dresser that held my life in 6 drawers. On the wall above my bed, I'd taped a faded photograph of my late husband, Charles, smiling on the porch of our old house in Wisconsin, holding a cherry pie he'd baked himself. He had flour on his cheek and pride in his eyes. It was our 47th wedding anniversary. The photo was curled at the edges now, like a leaf in fall. I often caught myself speaking to it softly in the evenings. "Still no word," I'd whisper. "Maybe tomorrow." But that morning, my voice stayed inside me. I didn't want to admit the obvious out loud. No one was going to call. There was a time I would have waited by the phone, checking the ringer, adjusting the volume, watching the screen for a blinking light. But not this year. I didn't even move it closer to the bed. I left it across the room where the charger barely reached, next to the window, where I used to sit in the early days, with hope tucked neatly between my palms like prayer. That hope has long since thinned into something quieter. Not quite despair, not yet resignation, just a soft ache where anticipation used to live. When my children moved me here, they called it a temporary transition. Temporary became indefinite. Then, indefinite became permanent. Now I am a line item in a monthly budget, a name in an administrative chart, a client with moderate needs and no known allergies. I have 2 children, Alan and Denise, both successful, both busy, both parents now themselves. I remember when they were small, how I used to prepare the most elaborate birthday breakfasts for them. Balloons tied to the chairs, pancakes shaped like animals, tiny notes folded inside their napkins with messages like, "You are my sunshine," and "How lucky I am to be your mum." I still remember the year Alan turned 8 and cried because I used blueberry syrup instead of regular. I apologized profusely, made a new batch, and watched him eat in silence, already knowing how to receive love without recognizing its cost. Denise was gentler, more reserved, always thanking me, always hugging me when she left for school. But she too began to fade as the years wore on, her visits shrinking in frequency, her voice growing more distant on the phone. Their lives bloomed while mine contracted. I don't remember the last time I was part of a group photo. I used to be the one holding the camera, making sure everyone fit into the frame, calling out, "Say cheese!" Now I'm not even asked to step in. At the last Thanksgiving I attended 3 years ago, the year before they moved me, I brought 2 pies, both homemade. I arrived wearing my nicest blouse, the one with the embroidered collar Charles used to say made me look like Sunday morning. Denise greeted me at the door with a tight hug and said, "Oh, good. You brought dessert. We weren't sure if you'd be up for baking." That should have been the clue. That quiet reclassification. I was no longer expected, just tolerated. And when they took photos after dinner, it was always just the cousins, or the kids with grandma on dad's side, or let's get one with the siblings. I stood in the kitchen washing dishes while they laughed in the living room, the sound drifting toward me like an old favorite song I wasn't allowed to hum along with anymore. I suppose some of that is my fault. I didn't argue when they said the house was too big for me. I didn't object when Alan said the stairs made him nervous. I nodded when Denise said it might be a relief not to worry about cooking for myself or dealing with the yard. "You've done enough, Mom," they said. "Now let us take care of you." That was the language of guilt wrapped in good intentions. But care, I've learned, can be another word for removal. They didn't take care of me. They relocated me, like a painting that no longer fits the aesthetic of a freshly redecorated room. It's not that Juniper Pines is a bad place. The staff is kind enough. The meals are warm, and the activities calendar is always full. Yoga, music hour, bingo, trivia nights. I attend occasionally, mostly out of politeness. I smile at the other residents, answer their questions about the weather or my breakfast or how long I've lived here. But I rarely ask anything back. I have no appetite for new connections. Not anymore. There's a kind of exhaustion that doesn't come from age, but from being slowly erased over time. 1 minute, you are the matriarch of a family, and the next, you're asking for permission to adjust the thermostat in your own room. That morning, on my birthday, I didn't cry. I didn't even sigh. I simply got dressed in the soft lavender sweater Denise had given me 5 years ago, the last birthday gift I can recall receiving, and sat by the window with a cup of black tea I made myself. I watched a squirrel dart along the fence outside, watched the clouds shift across the sky like bruises fading into nothing. At noon, the front desk rang to say I had a visitor. My heart jumped before reason caught it. It was a florist, a small arrangement of pink carnations and baby's breath, delivered with a card that read, "Happy birthday, Mom. Hope you're doing well." A and D. No names, no voices, just the minimum. I placed the flowers on the nightstand beside the photograph of Charles and looked at both, side by side. The man who once called me his miracle, and the children who now called me only when something needed renewing. My hand drifted to the drawer of my bedside table, where I kept my legal documents. I opened it slowly and ran my fingers along the folder labeled Will Original. My signature was still crisp. The pages were still uncreased, and yet something about them felt expired, like a promise made in a language no one spoke anymore. I closed the drawer and sat back in the chair, letting the silence wrap itself around me like a shawl. By the time the sun began to sink, casting golden light across the carpeted floor, I had made no calls, sent no texts, written no thank yous. I had nothing to thank anyone for. Instead, I sat and listened to the faint murmur of the television from the room next door, the occasional footstep in the hall, the distant creak of the building settling into its bones, and then I whispered, to no one and everyone, "I think that's enough." Not in anger, not in bitterness, just a quiet acknowledgement, a declaration without drama. I knew, deep in my bones, that something had ended, not the day, not the birthday, but a chapter of believing I still mattered to people who no longer noticed when I stopped speaking. And that was the beginning. The next morning, the phone rang, an unexpected sound in the otherwise predictable rhythm of my days. I almost didn't answer. Most of the calls that come through are automated messages from the pharmacy or someone trying to sell me a mobility aid I neither asked for nor needed. But something nudged me, a small whisper of instinct perhaps, and I picked up the receiver with a cautious, "Hello?" A woman's voice greeted me, bright and professional. Hello, Mrs. Monroe. This is Karen from Redwood Financial. We're just calling to confirm the continuation of the automatic authorization for account oversight. Your son, Alan, is still listed as your financial proxy, but the 1-year window is approaching expiration. Just a quick renewal signature is all we need. Would you prefer digital or mail delivery? I paused, not because I didn't understand what she meant, but because I understood too well. 1 year. That was what I had agreed to after my surgery, when I was groggy and vulnerable, with tubes in my arms and ice packs under my ribs. I remember Alan sitting beside the hospital bed, brushing crumbs from his car keys, saying things like, "Just temporary," and "Makes everything easier on you, Mum." I hadn't had the energy to argue. I had nodded. But that was 13 months ago. I cleared my throat and asked, "I'm sorry. Could you repeat the date that authorization expires?" She did, politely, then offered again to send the paperwork. I thanked her, said I'd prefer to think on it, and hung up. My tea had gone cold on the table beside me. I stared at it for a long moment, then stood and walked, slowly, deliberately, toward the drawer where I kept my documents. The folder marked Accounts was still in order. I pulled it out and brought it to my lap. My hands were steadier than I expected. It wasn't the legality that struck me. It was the realization that no one had told me the year was over. No one had checked in. Alan hadn't asked, "Do you still want me to handle things?" Denise hadn't called to say, "Just making sure you're still comfortable with this." The authorization was set to expire, and I was just another box on a checklist for someone at the bank. That's what I had become. A detail in someone else's system. And more than that, I realized, I had remained silent for so long that silence had become a permission slip. That day, after lunch, I asked Kelsey if she could help me log into my bank account. I told her I'd forgotten my password, which wasn't a lie. I'd let Alan reset it for me months ago. With some effort and a phone call for a code, we got in. She smiled, said, "There you go," and walked away, leaving me alone with the screen. There it was, my balance, my name, my money, still legally mine. No changes to ownership, just access rights granted temporarily to Alan. But I could see the transactions. Monthly payments to Juniper Pines, scheduled and consistent. Grocery orders from a service I didn't use. A few restaurant charges in cities I hadn't visited. A pair of plane tickets from 4 months ago. Departure from Denver. Destination Miami Beach. Alan's city. Denise's annual family vacation spot. I stared at those lines for a long time. Not with rage, not even sorrow, just the slow, expanding realization that I had not only funded my own containment, I had subsidized their freedom. They took the account, and they took liberties. I thought of the last conversation I had with Alan about money. He had mentioned inflation. "Things are tight," he said. "We're trying to make it all work." I remember nodding, offering to reduce the amount I transferred to their kids' college funds. He didn't argue. He just said, that would be helpful. And all the while, they were living more freely than I was breathing. I, who had eaten leftover casseroles and asked for extra paper towels at the front desk, rather than spend $1 on new napkins, was paying for their dinners. My pension, my savings, drained slowly by convenience, by quiet assumption, by that soft, deadly phrase, "We're just trying to make things easier." The rest of the afternoon I spent rereading everything I'd signed over the past year. The durable power of attorney, the temporary access agreement, the original will. I laid them out on the bed like old maps, each one marking a corner of my life I had surrendered for peace. But peace was not what I had received. What I had received was absence. And absence, when gifted in return for everything you've ever offered, is not peace. It's erasure. At dinner, I sat in the corner of the common room and watched a woman named Ruth peel the skin from her chicken with such focus you'd think she was performing surgery. A man named Stanley asked the nurse for his fourth glass of apple juice. Someone's TV blared a baseball game down the hall. It all passed around me like fog. I chewed each bite slowly, deliberately, not tasting anything. I was remembering. I was remembering the day I co-signed Alan's first lease. I was remembering the night Denise called me crying from a dorm bathroom because her roommate had stolen her shampoo and mocked her for praying. I had stayed on the phone with her for hours, whispering psalms until she fell asleep. I was remembering birthday parties with hand-decorated hats, Easter egg hunts in our backyard, nights sitting up sewing Halloween costumes after working double shifts. I was remembering all the things they had clearly forgotten. After dinner, I returned to my room and opened my email. The bank had sent a follow-up. Your request to review proxy authorization is pending. Please confirm how you'd like to proceed. I clicked the link, selected the option to disable automatic renewal, and typed in my name. Gladys E. Monroe. My fingers didn't tremble. My breath didn't hitch. I felt, for the first time in months, something like solidity. And then I did something strange. I opened a new tab and searched for how to revise a will. I didn't need to. I'd done it before, after Charles passed. But I wanted to see the language. I wanted to taste the idea of revision, of reclaiming. I read slowly, as though learning a new dialect, and then I closed the tab and sat very still. They wouldn't notice right away. The payments would continue another few weeks on their own, but eventually, a card would get declined. A call would come from the administrator saying the billing info needed updating. And then, I imagined, Alan would call. He would call, not because he remembered me, but because the flow had stopped, the current had broken, and I would let it. I would sit in my chair and watch the phone light up, and I would feel nothing but the quiet confirmation that I was no longer obligated to fund my own disappearance. That night, I pulled the curtains shut earlier than usual. I left the light on in the bathroom so the room wouldn't feel too dark. And I took one last look at Charles's photo before I climbed into bed. "I'm sorry," I whispered. "I let it go too far." But he didn't answer. The dead rarely do. Instead, I imagined him nodding, the way he used to when I finally came around to something he'd known all along. And then, just before I turned out the light, I made a promise to myself, not to be cruel, not to retaliate, but to take back what I had handed over so easily in the name of love. Because love, real love, does not spend your money and forget your birthday. It does not cash your checks and leave you with carnations from a florist who doesn't know your name. Real love remembers. Real love calls. Real love shows up, and if it doesn't, then it does not deserve to inherit what remains of you. 2 days passed before I heard from Alan, not with warmth or remorse, but with the same mechanical rhythm of someone accustomed to delayed responses and non-confrontational updates. He called mid-afternoon while I was rearranging the dresser drawers, removing the sweaters I no longer wore, and folding them into a box for donation. The phone buzzed once, twice, then again, with the same name that used to fill my heart with something soft and proud. Now, it thudded across the screen like a bill overdue. I let it ring once more before answering, holding the receiver to my ear with no anticipation. His voice was brisk, as always, somewhere between cheerful and distracted. "Hey, Mum, just checking in. Got a weird message from the billing office at Juniper Pines. Something about the card being declined. They're saying the payment bounced. I kept folding. Did they? I said evenly. There was a pause, as if he had expected something more maternal. Concern, confusion, perhaps even an apology. But I offered nothing. Yeah, he continued. It's probably just some kind of tech glitch. Can you take a look when you get a chance? I mean, I can cover it this time if you're busy or something. But they were kind of insistent. I just figured, since it's your account. There it was. The soft reveal. The flick of blame cloaked in politeness. Since it's your account, since it's your problem, since your role was always to handle it. I could hear in his tone the subtle frustration of someone mildly inconvenienced by the unravelling of something he thought would always hold. Not a child worried for his mother, but a man annoyed by a faucet that suddenly stopped working. I'll look into it, I said. Then silence. He waited, as if I might fill the air with questions. But I didn't. I let the quiet settle, heavy and unyielding. Eventually he said, "Okay, thanks. Talk soon," and hung up. That evening, I sat in the dining hall across from a woman named Evelyn, who insisted on sharing every detail of her bridge club days from Minneapolis. I nodded, smiled where appropriate, but my thoughts were elsewhere. I was thinking of the way Alan had once cried when he broke his arm falling off his bike and insisted on sleeping in my bed that night. I was thinking of how Denise used to sneak into the kitchen past bedtime, asking for just one more sip of cocoa, and how I'd pretend to be strict, but always gave in. I was thinking about how small, human, and needy they once were. How easy it was to love them then. How impossible it had become now that they needed nothing but my compliance. Later that night, while brushing my teeth, I remembered something peculiar. An envelope. Months earlier, after my surgery, Denise had mailed me a stack of documents to sign. Routine, she said. Hospital directives, care authorizations, billing permissions. I had signed without reading. It was the week I still couldn't walk unassisted, and everything felt too heavy. But one document, the last one in the stack, I had folded and slipped into the back of a drawer without signing. Something about it had unsettled me even then. Language too tidy, wording too vague. I hadn't given it much thought at the time, but now, standing in the glow of the bathroom mirror with my toothbrush still foaming in my mouth, I remembered it with sharp clarity. I found it the next morning, tucked beneath a stack of old letters and expired coupons in the second drawer of the nightstand. It was a revised beneficiary form, one that shifted everything to a shared trust account managed by both children. For streamlining purposes, the note had read in Denise's handwriting. We'll handle everything when the time comes. No need for the courts to get involved. I had not signed it. My initials were absent, but I could see her signature already there, as if she had anticipated no resistance. As if my consent was a given, a technicality. It was strange, realizing how easily people move from asking to assuming, how quickly the caretakers become the ones who write your ending while you're still here, blinking, breathing, watching. I set the form aside and looked at the names typed at the bottom. Alan and Denise. Beneficiaries? Executors. Decision-makers. They were still listed on everything. My will, my accounts, my legacy. I had handed them the pen and assumed they would write in my image. But people don't write who you were. They write who they need you to be in order to make their story easier. I didn't cry. I didn't panic. I didn't even feel anger, at least not in the volcanic way people expect. What I felt was a kind of hollowing out. Not emptiness exactly, but something akin to erosion, the soft, persistent stripping away of identity over time until all that's left is the outline of a woman who once mattered more than her usefulness. I spent the next few days quietly collecting. I gathered every document with a signature, every account statement, every record of payment. I requested a full history from the billing office at Juniper Pines and printed out the last 2 years of charges. I kept it all in a new folder labeled simply Correction. It was not vengeance I was preparing. It was order. Then came the call from Denise. Unlike Alan, she did not waste time with niceties. Her tone was clipped, her words efficient. "Hi, Mom. Just wanted to double-check that the payment for the care plan is still on your end." They called and said there was a pause. It's probably just a system hiccup, but it's kind of important. There's a renewal form due this week, and if it lapses, your room could get reassigned. She waited. I said nothing. "Mum?" she prompted. I wanted to ask her why she only ever called when something malfunctioned. I wanted to ask her if she remembered the sound of my voice on days not marked by invoices. But I didn't. Instead, I asked softly, "Is there anything you want me to bring next time you visit?" There was a long silence, and then she chuckled awkwardly. "Oh, well, we weren't planning anything soon. Things have been kind of hectic, and the kids have their recital next month, and honestly, it's probably better if you stay comfortable where you are. Less running around for everyone." Her words trailed off, like she realized they sounded worse once spoken, but she didn't correct them. She just cleared her throat and added, "Anyway, just let me know about the payment thing, okay?" After the call ended, I sat in the chair by the window and watched the wind rustle the hedges outside. It was still light out, but the shadows had already begun to stretch across the garden paths. The world, it seemed, was always getting ready to disappear before you realized the day was over. I opened the correction folder and made one final note at the bottom of the last page. No one forgets a mother. They simply decide she's no longer necessary. And then, beneath it, in my own hand, I wrote, "But I remember me, and that will have to be enough." The next morning, I woke with a clarity I hadn't felt in years. It wasn't euphoria. It wasn't purpose in the grand, cinematic sense. It was something quieter, like finding a thread in a fraying sweater and realizing you still had the fingers to follow it. I didn't rush. I didn't even get out of bed right away. I simply sat up, smoothed the blanket across my lap, and looked around the room as if I were seeing it again after a long absence. The lamp I'd bought at a yard sale decades ago, now dulled with time. The book I had been pretending to read for months. The small brass frame with Charles's face forever smiling in that Sunday morning sunlight. Nothing had changed, and yet I knew everything was about to. I called the front desk and asked for help accessing a notary service. They were surprised. I hadn't made an administrative request in months, but they complied. I told them I needed to update some legal records. "Just cleaning house," I said. "Figuratively?" They laughed politely. I didn't. After breakfast, I retrieved the folder again. This time, I wasn't looking to verify anything. I wasn't second-guessing. I was preparing. I knew the will needed a complete revision. Not a tweak, not a line change, but a restructuring. I didn't want to remove Alan and Denise in a flourish of anger. I wanted to erase the expectation that my legacy belonged to them by default. Because legacy isn't about blood. It's about attention. It's about presence. And in 3 years of living behind this beige curtain and sanitized meals, they had given me none. Instead, I made a list. Not of grievances, but of names. Real people. People who had shown up without being asked. Helen Morales, the overnight nurse, who once sat with me for an hour after a dizzy spell, even though her shift had ended. Grace, the volunteer who brought books and always remembered which genre I liked, who asked real questions and waited for real answers. Even the janitor, Tim, who whistled Sinatra as he mopped and once fixed the loose armrest on my recliner without ever taking credit. I had laughed at myself at first. What was I going to do? Leave them my savings? But the longer I thought about it, the more sense it made. They had invested time. They had offered dignity. They had, in small ways, made sure I was still visible. I reached out to an attorney, whose card I had kept tucked behind the mirror for years. We had spoken once, shortly after Charles passed, and he had been kind without being condescending. I left a message. He called me back within the hour. "Mrs. Monroe," he said, "we can absolutely make those changes. I'll come to you. Just email me what you'd like drafted." His calm tone didn't ask for explanations. It simply offered service. I wrote it out that evening, with a pen instead of a keyboard. My hands shook once or twice, but I steadied them. "This is not punitive," I wrote. "This is preservation." And then, with everything lined up, documents, names, legal support, I returned to the one thing I had been avoiding, the calendar. I opened the appointment app on the shared facility tablet and checked the staff logs. I found the note that made me pause. Payment update required by the 15th. Room reservation under conditional status pending billing confirmation. That was 5 days from now. I stared at the screen. 5 days. That was the window. That was the moment the narrative could fracture. The assumption could break. They would expect, as always, that things would be handled, that the room would be paid for, that the contract would renew, and they would never have to think about it. But not this time. I wouldn't call to warn them. I wouldn't remind them like a secretary babysitting a meeting. I would simply step aside and let the consequences find their feet. But first, I wanted to do one last thing, not for them, for myself. I opened the drawer beneath the sink, the one where I kept things that didn't have a category. Inside was a small velvet pouch. I had once intended to give it to Denise, a gold chain that had belonged to my grandmother. But now, I placed it carefully into a manila envelope and wrote a name on it. Helen. Not because I wanted to wound Denise, but because Helen had earned it without asking. I did the same with a quilt Charles and I had stitched together during our first winter in retirement. I'd meant for Alan to have it one day. Instead, I folded it gently into a storage bag, labelled it Grace, and slid it under the bed to wait. These weren't acts of bitterness. They were acknowledgements, real gifts, small and sincere, to people who still saw me as someone more than a line item on a to-do list. And that, more than anything, felt like returning home to myself. When the sun dipped that night and the halls grew quiet, I turned off the lights and let the room fill with twilight. I didn't check my phone. I didn't refresh my inbox. I simply whispered into the silence. "You've done enough. You can rest now." I wasn't sure who I was talking to. My past self, maybe? Or the woman I had been before motherhood swallowed every corner of her. But the words lingered, soft and solid, like hands pressing against my shoulders in reassurance. And in that hush, I finally understood that correction is not cruelty. It's just clarity, long delayed. It was a Tuesday morning when the consequences finally caught up with them. I knew the date well. I had circled it on my small paper calendar weeks before. A faint red ring around the 15th. Not dramatic, not angry, just quiet preparation. I had marked it without telling anyone, not even Helen, who had grown accustomed to the subtle rhythm of my days. That morning, I dressed as I usually did, in my softest slacks and a cardigan Charles had once called my peace flag. I poured my tea slowly, let it steep, and sat by the window with the radio low, the sunlight thin across the carpet. Outside, the hedges trembled faintly in the breeze, and I could hear the wheels of someone's walker rolling past my door. I remember thinking, they're at the airport right now, and smiling, not with malice, but with certainty, because that was the day Alan and Denise were due to fly to Arizona. A quick break, they had called it the last time I overheard them speaking to someone else on speakerphone. I hadn't been included in the conversation. I never was anymore, but I remembered the words clearly. Yeah, just a week to decompress. We booked the Airbnb months ago. Mum's place is set up. Everything's handled. That was the phrase that stuck with me. Everything's handled. But everything, as it turned out, had been handled by me, paid for by me, managed by me. And when I had stepped back, quietly, deliberately, that everything began to wobble. At 9:17 a.m., my phone buzzed. Alan. I let it ring. Then it rang again, and again. I waited until the third time before picking up. Hi, Mom, he said, his voice tight, forced casual. Quick question. We're checking in, and something's going on with the payment for the home. You didn't change anything, did you? I sipped my tea. I don't handle that anymore, I said. The authorization expired. Silence. Then a quick, right, but you didn't renew it? I mean, they said something about a billing failure. Are you okay? Is everything okay? He was trying now, trying to stay calm, trying to sound like a concerned son instead of a man whose plans were unraveling in real time. I offered nothing but the truth. I decided to pause my contributions. I thought you'd want the opportunity to handle it yourselves. More silence. Then hurried. Well, we're about to board. Can we talk about this later? I'll call you when we land. I nodded, though he couldn't see me. Of course, I said softly. You do what you need to do? They took off with the illusion that everything was solvable, that a conversation later would patch the holes, that love could be summoned on demand, like customer support. But I had removed the scaffolding, and I had no intention of rebuilding it. By the afternoon, the real panic began. The facility administrator came by my room, a folder in hand, brows knit together in professional concern. Ms. Monroe, she said gently, we've reached out to your family, but we haven't received updated billing information. Since the contract now falls back to you directly, we'd like to verify how you'd like to proceed. I thanked her, asked for a few days to review my options, and signed a temporary continuation, on my terms, with my money. I was not leaving. That had never been the point. I was staying, but they were being removed. From the process, from the benefit, from the center of the arrangement they'd built on my silence. That evening, Denise called. Her voice was sharper than Alan's, laced with accusation buried beneath politeness. Hi, Mom. Listen, we got some really confusing messages from the staff at Juniper. They're saying the billing is now your responsibility. Did something happen? Did someone pressure you into that? I let her speak. I always did. She continued. Because this feels sudden, and we're just a little blindsided. We thought everything was settled. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't explain anything she hadn't already heard and chosen to ignore. I simply said, no one pressured me. I'm making decisions for myself again. Another pause. Then the inevitable. But we've structured our expenses around the idea that your care was handled. We're not in a place to absorb that right now. Her honesty surprised me. For once, no excuses, just the truth. They had counted on me disappearing quietly into the financial background. I let her sit with it. Then I said, "That's something you'll have to figure out." She didn't yell. She didn't cry. She just sighed, frustrated, confused, perhaps even scared. Because if I could do this, what else could I do? What else might I take back? The next day, I received 3 emails from Alan in a row. The first was neutral. "Hey, just looping back on that billing thing. Let's talk?" The second was tinged with stress. "Please respond. We're being told we'll need to set up a new payment plan immediately." The third was something different. "If this is about us being away right now, we can reschedule. We didn't mean to make you feel unimportant." That one I read twice. Unimportant. Not hurt. Not excluded. Just unimportant. The word landed like a flat stone on still water. No splash. Just rings moving outward, touching everything I had once hoped to leave them. I replied with one sentence. "Thank you for your concern. I am managing everything directly now." That was all. No warmth, no closure. Just a fact. That was what they'd reduced me to, after all. Functionality. A woman who pays. A woman who covers. A woman who quietly ensures their stability, while hers is background noise. By the end of the week, I had received messages not just from Alan and Denise, but from Alan's wife, from Denise's husband, even from their financial planner. Each note wrapped in the language of logistics. No one asked how I was doing. No one apologized for forgetting my birthday. No one acknowledged the years of care I had given, the weekends of babysitting, the casseroles delivered when they moved houses, the cash quietly wired when tuition fell short. Just, "What's happening with the account?" And "Can we talk about restoring access?" I didn't answer any of them. I printed them instead, put them in a folder labeled Evidence, and stored it in the drawer beneath my socks, not because I needed legal backup, but because I wanted to remember the order of things, how quickly concern follows inconvenience, how fast love speaks when money stops moving. On Sunday, Alan called again. This time, he left a voicemail. "Mum, I'm sorry if we've done something to upset you. I don't know what's going on, but we can work this out. Just, please talk to us. We're family." I played it twice, then deleted it. That night, I took out my notebook. Not the legal one, not the spreadsheet, just the old blue journal with the worn spine where I used to write meal plans and shopping lists back when Charles was alive. On a clean page, I wrote, "What I owe no one." Then I listed explanations, apologies, warnings, gratitude for tolerance, forgiveness without change, silence that protects the unkind. I closed the book and placed it under my pillow. That same week, the revised will arrived in a white envelope, hand-delivered by my attorney. He stayed for tea. Not because he needed to, but because he wanted to. He asked if I was certain. I said I was. He nodded. "You're not the first," he said, "but you're one of the few who does it before it's too late." I knew what he meant. Many people rewrite their endings with breath they can't control. I still had mine. I intended to use it. The new will listed no children, no grandchildren, no default heirs. Instead, it included small legacies, a scholarship fund for a nursing student from a working-class background, a donation to the local library, a cash gift to the facility for outdoor seating upgrades, and individual bequests to people who had shown me, in quiet, consistent ways, that I still mattered. It wasn't about fairness. It was about recognition. There's a difference. The final clause read, "All remaining assets shall be distributed at the discretion of the executor, as long as such distributions reflect the spirit of lived appreciation." I underlined it before signing. Then I signed my name, slowly, with full attention. Gladys Elaine Monroe. Not mother, not grandma, not Mrs. Monroe from room 203. Just me. My 83rd birthday arrived with no warning, no fanfare, and no expectation. I didn't circle the date on the calendar this time. I didn't mention it to Helen or Grace. I didn't wait for a call or count the days since I last heard from Alan or Denise. The only plan I made was to wake up and see how I felt. There's a particular kind of freedom that comes when you finally stop auditioning for the role of the cherished elder, when you step down from the imaginary stage of familial relevance and realize that the silence left in their absence is no longer empty but clarifying. I had prepared tea by 6 and dressed in a slate blue dress I'd almost given away last year but hadn't. Not because I was hoping someone would see me in it, but because I finally wanted to look in the mirror and not see a patient, a dependent, a budgetary item. Just a woman with a name and a dress she still liked. I walked down to the garden by myself. It was early enough that the corridors were quiet, most residents still asleep. The staff changing shifts with gentle footsteps and murmured greetings. The air was cool and sweet, with that smell of earth that only reveals itself at dawn. I sat on the wooden bench beneath the birch tree and closed my eyes. I thought of nothing. Not the will, not the children, not even Charles. Just breath and bird song and the hum of something that felt dangerously close to peace. When I finally opened my eyes, Helen was standing a few steps away, holding a paper cup of coffee and a grocery store bouquet of tulips in one hand. "You didn't tell me," she said, mock accusatory. 83's a pretty damn good number. I smiled. Didn't want to trouble anyone. She sat beside me, handed me the flowers, and pulled a small envelope from her pocket. Inside was a handmade card. On the front, a drawing of a teacup, and the words, "Still steeping." I laughed out loud, and it startled both of us. Not because I never laughed, but because I hadn't done so in a way that echoed in weeks. Helen squeezed my arm and said, "You're not invisible, you know. You're just quieter than they deserve." I didn't answer. I didn't need to. At 10:30, I went back upstairs and found a tray waiting in my room. A slice of lemon cake, a candle, and a folded piece of construction paper covered in signatures. The housekeeping staff, the aides, the receptionist, even Tim the janitor, a chorus of people who had no obligation to remember, and yet they did. They came by in waves throughout the day. Small hellos, little gifts, a knitted scarf, a bookmark, a bottle of lavender lotion. One aide brought me a plate of her grandmother's cookies and whispered, "You remind me of her, the way you sit with your hands folded, like you're still listening even when no one is talking." I touched her face and thanked her. That was enough. That afternoon, a gathering formed in the rec room. Not a party, not really, but something better. Grace had organized a reading of favourite poems. They let me go last. I chose a short one by W.S. Merwin, about presence, about the simple act of being where you are. When I finished, there was a beat of silence, then a small round of clapping. Not out of obligation, but appreciation. I caught Helen's eye across the room. She raised her coffee cup to me, and I nodded once, slowly, not to her, but to the moment. Sometime later, after the reading ended, I returned to my room and saw that the light on my phone was blinking. One voicemail. I pressed play. It was Denise. Her voice was taut, rehearsed. "Hi, Mum. I know things have been strained. I wanted to say happy birthday. The kids are busy with school, and Alan's been going through a lot, and, well, we didn't want to overwhelm you, but we're thinking of you. Call us if you feel up to it." Then a pause. A long one. And a faint sigh before the line disconnected. I deleted it. Not because I was angry, but because I no longer wanted to keep evidence of gestures made only when guilt set in. I knew she had sent it to herself as much as to me, a voicemail as an alibi. I'm tired of holding their alibis. They are not mine to keep. The sun dipped slowly behind the hills as I stood by the window, watching the shadows stretch and the sky bloom gold. I poured myself a glass of water, opened a tin of Charles's favourite peppermints I'd kept hidden all these years, and let one dissolve on my tongue. And then I took out the final copy of the will, sealed it in an envelope, and slid it into the mailbox slot across from the elevators. It was done. No one would knock on my door that evening, breathless with apology. No one would show up with flowers from a real florist or a gift bought months in advance. There would be no speech about how they'd failed me or how they finally saw the ways I had shown up for them without fanfare. And that was the point. This wasn't a story where they learn and return. This was a story where I stayed, and they didn't. And I had stopped making that my fault. I sat on the edge of my bed, kicked off my shoes, and pulled the blanket over my knees. Somewhere down the hallway, someone was playing piano, faltering, imperfect notes that made no effort to be performance-ready. I listened to them without judgment, just like someone might have once listened to me. Not because I was good, but because I was there. It was the best birthday I'd had in years, and they didn't even know. The days that followed moved with the slow, inevitable rhythm of late winter. Sunlight lengthened inch by inch across the window panes, and the wind softened just enough to hint that change, though never promised, was possible. I went about my routines without fanfare. Morning tea, a short walk to the garden, an occasional puzzle, an occasional poem. The phone no longer startled me when it rang, because I no longer waited for it. Alan left one more message. Brief, polite, apologetic in tone but not in heart. And I saved it, not to listen to again, but as a reminder that closure rarely comes dressed in the clothes we expect. Denise didn't call again, and that too became part of the rhythm. A kind of quiet that asked nothing of me. A silence that didn't accuse or press or beg for grace it had not earned. One evening, Helen asked if I wanted to join her for a walk outside the property gates. "We'll go slow," she promised, "just to see what's on the other side of the hill." I almost said no, out of habit, but then I realized that the version of myself who defaulted to no was no longer the one making decisions. So I put on my scarf, pulled the zipper of my coat up to my chin, and followed her into the evening. The slope wasn't steep, and we stopped often, not to catch our breath, but simply to look. A cluster of birds moving across the sky in imperfect patterns. A house in the distance with a yellow porch light flickering on. At the top of the hill, there was a bench, old, slightly rusted, but strong. We sat, and Helen said, "If you could go back and change one thing, would you?" I didn't answer immediately. I closed my eyes and let the air fill my lungs. Then I said, "Only the waiting." I would have stopped waiting sooner. That night, I took out my journal and flipped past the pages of lists and letters unsent, past the memories I had once needed to trap in ink to prove they'd happened. On the last page, I wrote a sentence I hadn't expected. I did not get everything I gave, but I kept enough of myself to begin again. Then I closed the book and slid it back under the drawer, no longer as a record of survival, but as a testament that the final chapters belonged to the person still holding the pen. The legal matters resolved quietly. My attorney confirmed that the documents were processed, the updates complete. There would be no fanfare, no reading of the will with stunned faces and gasps of betrayal. No last-minute calls pleading for explanation. There would be simply the truth, delivered without flourish. This is what she chose. She chose recognition over obligation. She chose to remember the hands that reached back when she reached out. And she chose herself, not as a final act of defiance, but as a long overdue restoration. Spring arrived eventually, the way it always does, hesitant, uncertain, and then all at once. The garden outside my window bloomed in uneven bursts. Violets in one corner, daffodils stretching toward the warmth, like questions wanting answers. I started spending more time outside again. I brought books and a small thermos of tea. Sometimes Helen joined me, sometimes not. And in those moments, I stopped performing the role of the woman waiting to be claimed by her family and simply became the woman who had claimed herself. When I think of Alan and Denise now, it is not with hate or bitterness. It is with a distant, aching fondness reserved for things that were once whole and could have stayed that way, if only they had been tended. I no longer rewrite our story in my mind. I do not imagine better versions of them. I do not pretend we were something we weren't. Instead, I leave the past to itself, and I carry forward only what serves the next breath. There's a kind of quiet that doesn't feel like loss. It feels like landing, like the ground meeting your feet, finally, after years of falling in slow motion. That's what this is now. Not revenge, not justice, not even healing. Just arrival. And when the time comes, whether it's a week from now or years, I hope someone finds the journal, not for the drama, not for the story, but for the sentence at the end. The sentence that says, she knew, and she chose anyway, because that, in the end, is the most anyone can hope for. To be the one who chooses, not the one who is chosen too late.